She was taken to the auction thinking she would only lose the family home. But when the new owner looked at her and said the words that would mark her life forever, Isaura realized she had been sold as part of her own father's dead. What happened next, no one in the city ever forgot. São Sebastião das Pedras lay under a sky the color of boiled cassava, air thick with heat and dust. The process smelled of sweat and tobacco, boiled coffee, and the sour tang of cowhide left in the sun. Men sat on broken benches. Women shielded their eyes with the hems of their skirts. At the raised plank where the auctioneer hammered his piece of wood, a line of names and numbers passed like a slow, ugly prayer. The town had gathered as if the selling were a festival. In truth, it was the opposite, a ritual of surrender. Isaura Andrade felt the dust grind into the soles of her feet. She was 19, her hair braided and coiled at the nape, hands that could mend a shirt and peel the stubborn burrs from a cotton plant. Her father stood beside her, Evaristo Andrade, once a man of some small claim, now hollowed by debt and by nights of drinking to forget that which could not be forgotten. Beside them, the children, Manuel, Pedro, Carolina, clung to the hem of her dress, their small faces powdered with sand and worry. The auctioneer's voice rose and fell like the bellows of a tired ox. Lot 42, the auctioneer declared, the Andrade holding, 2 alqueires, simple dwelling, 1 plow, future crop of cotton, sold to settle debts. Evaristo's eyes were red-ringed. He had tried to keep his pride. He had argued with men with ink-stained hands who counted rays and promises, with the agiota who would not wait for rain. The hammer fell, and with it fell the fate of land and livelihood. Isaura felt the plank under her feet as if it were a door that had shut. A different murmur ran through the crowd then, a cold note that made the children's lips tremble. A man came forward. He had the gait of someone used to riding hard and sleeping little. Boots cracked, a leather band across his forehead. A ragged scar split one cheek and ran like a pale river into his jaw. His hair was cropped close. His eyes were dark and quick, and when he smiled, there was a measure of danger in the way his teeth showed. He was not the kind of gentleman who would buy land because it smelled of possibility. He bought what others would not touch. Tertuliano Cabral paid in coin and in the promise of muscle. He paid more than any man in the square, and then, when the hammer lifted, he stepped down from his horse with a carriage of men behind him. People exchanged glances. Some lowered their heads. The agiota whispered to a man in a wide hat. Pascual Macedo, who had interests and manners like a thin, lethal vine, stood to one side, palms folded. He watched as a man who had lived outside certain laws took possession inside them. Payment is made, the auctioneer said. The holding is Tertuliano Cabral's. Evaristo swayed as if struck. Isaura wanted to go to him and lift him up, wanted to tell him that a field could be reworked, a debt squeezed, that kindness existed. Instead, she felt the hand of the marshal touch the small of her back, guiding her forward like an object already catalogued. "It will be settled," said a voice, Tertuliano's, low and unexpectedly close. "And the man who answers for the land shall take in its charge the caretaking of its household. That includes those bound to it." There was a silence so thick it pressed against the eardrums. Isaura understood with the lucidity of someone who had watched her father's debt swallow hope. That to settle a debt here was to settle the person. That was the way of the sertão when the heat made people barter anything for a night's sleep. She had heard of such bargains. The townsfolk spoke of them under their breaths at the market, but had believed they belonged to other families, not to the Andrade name, that had hummed in its small dignity for a generation. "Then I shall take the daughter," Tertuliano said. His voice was strange then, not merely a purchase, but an assertion, a closing of a circle. "She will be my wife in name. The debts are cleared. The law is satisfied." A laugh like a cracked bell came from Pascual Macedo. He stepped forward, palms wide, in a smooth, practiced gesture of civility. "A clever man, this Cabral," he murmured. "But what is a wife to a man who has bought a holding? The law knows many uses." Tertulliano's jaw tightened. He might have been many things, but he had codes that were his own. He had lived the open spaces where a man learned quickness of hand and the thin mercy of other men. He had learned to kill and to be other than a gentleman. Yet in that instant, something in the square, its hunger, its small, hot judgments, made the exchange obscene. Isaura's mouth opened. She tried to say no. The sound that came was thin as cotton thread. "Father," she said. The dust made it hard to breathe. Evaristo's face folded. He reached for her as if to shield her, and for a heartbeat, Isaura thought he might strike some bargain with his bare hands. But the debt had taken the shape of a noose around his neck. He could only nod slow and broken. Tertulliano looked at her with an expression that could have been calculation, or curiosity, or some flicker of pity she did not yet know how to accept. Then he leaned in and, to the shame of the square, and the shame that would seed years of complicated tenderness, he said words like a command. "You were sold to me. Open your legs." The sentence landed as a blow. It was not merely vulgar. It was meant to fold her into a thing already named. Isaura felt the children's small bodies press at her skirt. Hands, men's hands, strangers' hands, reached to set her under a patchwork of obligations. Her throat closed. She thought for an instant that nothing would ever unmake that line of 3 words. She was taken to the carriage as if the world had been braided down into a single harsh braid of movement. The town passed in a river of heat and color. The white of the chapel, the brazenness of trade, Pasquale's lips in whisper to a man with a ledger. Outside the town, the road rose toward the Serra do Araripe and the Fazenda Pedra Grande, where the house waited like a white bruise on the landscape. On the journey, Tertulliano sat opposite her. The scar along his cheek flexed when he spoke. He did not ask her again to perform or to obey. He asked, instead, small things: her name, where in the house she had learned to sew, what book she most wished to read. He listened with the intensity of someone used to listening for sudden sounds in the dark. It was an odd, uneasy tenderness, one that came layered with ownership. That first night at Pedra Grande, Isaura slept by a window that opened onto the blackness of the fields. The house smelled of leather and lamp oil, of boiled manioc left cooling in a pot. She trembled with a new kind of learned vigilance. Jacira, who ran the household with an iron tenderness, half governess, half keeper of secrets, brought her a cup of water and a thin blanket. "You are safe enough here for now," Jacira said in the curt, practical voice of someone who had sheltered more than one broken thing. "We will see daylight. You will learn where the keys live." The keys, they were themselves symbols, small cold metals that opened doors, chests, rooms that held other people's histories. Isaura found that at Pedra Grande there were more doors than in her father's cottage. A chapel that smelled faintly of wax and old prayers, stables where horses stamped, a locked 3rd floor that hummed with rumor. It was, in its way, another kind of prison. Tertulliano did not sleep in the room next to hers, but his presence was like a weather that warmed or threatened. At times he came to the kitchen and sat on a crate, watching the servants work as if measuring their worth by movements. He was quick to praise a good seam or a meal that had been well salted, and quick to punish a man who stole flour. There was a sharpness to his justice. A man in the fields who overstepped would find a scar to remember. For Isaura, the earliest days were a study in small humiliations and larger bargains. She cooked for people who scowled, mended shirts for men who spat on porches. She learned the precise way to braid the children's hair so the wind would not catch it on long rides. And she kept watch when the house slept, learning the syllables of its dark by the sighing of rafters. Yet the worst of the first months was not the work. It was the language she had heard in the square, those words that had named her as property. She carried them like a bed of coals. She was not foolish. She understood the social calculus that had led her there. But understanding did not remove the weight of being claimed. Tertulliano did what he could in the shape of a scarred man to make the claiming less violent. He brought, once, a rose wrapped in oilcloth and left it on her pillow. He repaired the piano in the sitting room, a small, vain instrument that had belonged to a wife before wars and deaths. When he played, the notes came out uneven but honest, like a man trying to sing with a throat that had been used for threats. He never said the auction words again, yet they haunted the margins of his silence. At unexpected moments, he told her things of a life on the run, of a desert moon and a friend's last breath, of the heat of a shootout and the smell of burnt rope. He spoke of Mariana, whose name Tertulliano said once like a prayer or an accusation. Mariana had been someone who loved recklessly and had died in a slow, poisonous way, an event that had become a blade in his chest. For years he had thought himself culpable, as if his absence had left space for malice. He carried that grief like a second scar. Isaura began, timidly and then with steadier resolve, to test the edges of the life that had been thrust upon her. If she could not undo the sale, she could learn to map the house and the men who worked it. Early mornings she rose to mend a worker's torn shirt and to ask questions about how the irrigation channels were managed, where water collected after rare rains. When Tertulliano caught her reading a book brought from the town library, lines about law and the practice of justices, he did not scorn her, though his eyes gathered something like surprise. "Books are dangerous for fools," he said once, but the remark came with a corner of approval. "They teach you to see fences where there were only walls. Keep reading." So she read. She read of contracts and of the little laws that men like Pasquale knew how to twist. She read of harbors and the accounts of witnesses, of how testimony could be gathered so that a court of men could not easily set it aside. She learned the value of paper and the weight of ink. Knowledge, she discovered, made her less vulnerable. The house, too, began to change beneath her hands and under the touch of the children. Manuel laughed with the brashness of 8-year-old certainty. Pedro, smaller, watched everything with bright, suspicious eyes. Carolina, the smallest, loved the sound of the piano. They were, in the evenings when the lamps glowed and the air cooled, small islands of light. Isaura would braid their hair, hum the songs her mother had sung, and think of the day she'd traded the field for their safety. Outside, the world conspired. Pasquale Macedo, for all his civility, moved with his own hunger. He had office in a house in San Geronimo, and a smile that wrapped bargains in velvet. He looked at Pedra Grande with a greed lubricated by centuries of local power. Pasquale met with men in the square's tavern. He wrote notes and sent riders. Isaura, when she learned to read the ledger that Jasira kept, found entries that had names tied to debts and to poison-sweet words. There were hints that Mariana had been unwell in ways that had not been natural. When Isaura unearthed a small leather-bound diary, Mariana's, left in a trunk and hidden beneath tattered garments, one page held a trembling line about a shared dinner and a taste of bitterness disguised in tea. The diary became an entryway into the past. In its slanting hand, Mariana had mapped a small intimacy that Tertulliano had been too late to protect. She wrote of a name she did not trust, Pasquale, who smiled at dinner parties and whose eyes were always on the table of those he wished to own. Mariana's voice in ink was tender and frightened. Isaura read in the lamplight and felt a cold rising. She was not the first to be made small by the country's hunger for more. When she told Tertulliano, he shut the piano lid with a force that made their bones feel like something brittle. He said nothing for a long time. Then, very quietly, he said, "He poisons people with words, too. He works through men who owe him favors. He keeps witnesses bought with bread. I could kill him and be done." Isaura looked at him then. at the scar that etched his face, and saw a man who could have chosen the simplest justice. He had the hands to take a life and the history of a man who had lived by that truth. But there was something in him that held back. "There are other ways," she said. "Not all our fights must taste of blood." It was a statement of a principle and a choice, and Tertulliano stared at her as if at a mirror he had not yet cleaned. The fact that she said it while the square had still been hot in their ears made him reconsider the uses of force. He had come to Pedra Grande with a kind of force. Now he began to see a different measure of power, one that required patience and the collection of proofs, the coaxing of witnesses, the slow unspooling of hidden accounts. They began to gather evidence. It was not romantic work. It was the dull, steady business of asking servants about meals, keeping receipts wrapped in oilcloth, comparing handwriting, gathering names of men who had borrowed and not repaid. Jacira, who had witnessed the household for years, was indispensable. She knew where secrets tended to rest. Sebastián the Capataz, who trusted Tertulliano more than any man in the region because Tertulliano had once saved him from a band of robbers, began to ride up into the woodlands to watch the roads and to take notes. The younger men learned how to keep their heads down and their ears open. Pascual retaliated in ways that were surgical rather than crude. A man who had been helpful to Isaura found his plow broken one morning. A neighbor who had promised testimony suddenly fell ill. Letters arrived threatening quiet ruin if certain questions were not left alone. Pascual's methods were about control more than immediate violence, poison that entered a man's credit, the slow strangling of reputation. In the town, he cultivated magistrates and men who would find reasons to call witnesses unreliable. Isaura felt the pressure like a tightening band. At night, she woke with the taste of dust on her tongue and the image of Pascual's smooth face in her memory. She thought often of the auctioneer's hammer and of the sentence that had made her body property in the eyes of some. Each threat from Pascual was a reminder that her life had been bargained before she had consented to any of it. Then the worst of Pascual's cruelty cut through. He arranged, with a practiced charity, for a midnight raid on a small village where children were hidden, children he intended to use as leverage. He hired men to seize what looked like a baby carriage and to bring the small ones back to his own men. It was deception that smelled of rumor. It was a plan that used children as currency. On the night the men rode, the rain began for the first time in months, a stuttering, uncertain thing that turned the roads to mud. The lamps at Pedra Grande sputtered. Isaura had been reading, Mariana's diary open on her lap, when the alarm came. Hoofbeats, the clatter of a scuffle, the shrill cry of a woman. Jacira ran to the door. Sebastián grabbed his pipe. Tertulliano pulled on his coat as if he might shake the storm off and step into combat. They found the tracks at the edge of the wood, marks like the fingers of a hand tracing the land. Men and cows had come with ropes. The children, Manuel, Pedro, Carolina, were not there. Isaura's heart fell into a silence so deep that for an instant she could not breathe. Then the wind took the sound of her scream and tossed it above the trees. Tertulliano moved like a man who had planned for every eventuality but this. He mounted with a speed that made the mud fly from the horse's flanks. "We follow," he said to Sebastián, in a voice that left no argument. "We find them. We bring them home." It was a pursuit that felt like the turning of a fate wheel. They cut across gullies, over stubborn rocks, through the spatter of rain. Isaura rode with a fierce concentration that made the world narrow, the beat of a gallop, the ache in her wrists, the shape of the land. Her memory was a film of small glinting images, Manuel's grin, Carolina's fingers in her braid, Pedro's suspicion of strangers. She could taste the mud and the metal of fear. They found the captors near a creek where the men had paused, thinking they were beyond notice. A small skirmish followed, not the glorious shootout of storybooks, but a brutal, grinding series of motions. A man's tumble, a horse's shriek, the sharp crack of wood. Tertulliano did not kill in cold blood. He aimed to disable, to disarm. He moved with a hand steadier than the men he had once been, as if the years had taught him which hands to break and which to spare. In the confusion, one of Pascual's men raised the knife and lunged. Isaura, by impulse more than plan, stepped in front of the knife, and the blade found her arm instead. It was not a graphic wound. It was a line that stunned her with pain and with the smell of iron. She tasted a fierce, animal fury, an ancient need to protect that overrode everything else. She felt Tertuliano's hands on her, holding her up, his voice cutting through the storm. "Keep them," he said to Sebastian. "Take the children, lock them in the stable." They carried the small ones back through the night, each of them wrapped in blankets and shivering, their eyes big with a trauma too deep for words. Isaura, in the light of an oil lamp, watched as Manuel clung to a piece of her apron. The wound on her arm throbbed but did not threaten life. What hurt more was the knowledge that Pascual had learned how to threaten what she loved. In the days after, the house at Pedra Grande hummed with a pressure that edged toward law. They could not simply kill Pascual and bury the matter. Tertuliano insisted on gathering witnesses. Isaura, with the diary and the men's names, began to shape a case. Guilherme Sá, a man who had once been Pascual's friend and who had left in disgust when the other man began to trade in poison, answered their summons. He would testify that he had seen Pascual's men slipping something like a powder into wine. He would speak a fawn of conscience that rang too loudly to be ignored. Guilherme's courage was not without cost. There were threats to his own family. He came anyway, because he had learned in his own life that silence bent men into monsters. The courtroom that finally convened was not like the courts of cities where robes billowed. It was a hot room with wooden benches, men who smelled of tobacco and prayer, and a judge whose temperament was brittle. Testimony was given in measured voice and in tears. The diary was read out loud, each line like a small lance. Pascual smiled in court, as if the whole thing were a play and he the well-dressed lead. But the evidence was a net, and it was hard to unravel. Guilherme's testimony, Mariana's diary, the receipts, and the men who had seen the raft leaving the creek, all of it knit together. Pascual's patrons tugged at strings and tried to raise doubts, but the net held. When the verdict came, it was not the quick blood that some had expected. It was something slower, legal and public and shaming. Pascual was convicted of conspiracy and culpability in the poisoning of Mariana and in the plot to kidnap children. His sentence was a long one, enough to remove his hands from the region for a generation. There was no triumphal dancing at Pedra Grande. The victory felt brittle, as if they had snatched a small island of justice from a wide sea of injustice. Tertuliano stood in the yard and watched the dust settle. Isaura took Manuel on her lap and felt his breath against her neck. The scar on her arm would be a mark that she could show her children as proof that love sometimes demanded cost. Years fell away like leaves. The land at Pedra Grande changed its face. Where once the fields had been sputtering and uncertain, they learned the slow habits of careful stewardship. Water catchment pools were dug, small dams that turned trickles into streams. The house opened to the village in ways it had not before. Jacira oversaw a small infirmary where a midwife taught new mothers how to braid their baby's hair. Sebastian trains neighbors to tend cotton without losing seed to the greedy agencies that had taken their father's harvests. Isaura learned, with a practical hunger, to manage the household's books and then, gradually, the land itself. Men who once thought themselves masters of her life watched as she took up the tools of management with a sure hand. She negotiated with traders, arranged for seed at fair prices, taught women in the village to count their own race and to plan for seasons of drought. She did not do it with rhetoric or with speeches. There were no sermons from her lips, but with the accumulation of small, unromantic acts. A ledger kept clean, a canal dug at the right angle, a roster of men and women who would watch over each other's sick. Her relationship with Tertulliano matured into something that could be named without feeling tainted. There were nights they shared a bed in which consent had been a path walked toward, not a bargain sealed at an auction. There were moments of tenderness. He left roses, he learned the names of the children's favorite songs, he admitted his guilt aloud, and did the quiet, ordinary work of being present when a man needed steadiness. He also told her stories of his past that stung. He confessed things he had done that could never be undone. Isaura's love for him was not the stuff of sudden conversion. It was an allegiance born of shared labor and of the knowledge that he had chosen restraint where he might once have chosen violence. There were nights when shadows crept up in the shape of the past. Isaura would wake and see Pascual's smooth smile behind her eyelids. She would think of the auctioneer's hammer. Once, on a wet night, a man came to the gate with a knife, a remnant of Pascual's reach, and Tertulliano dealt with him in a way that avoided bloodshed but enforced order. That night, when the danger had passed, Tertulliano sat with his hands in the lamplight and let his fingers find Isaura's. No grand words were exchanged. There was only the quiet that follows a storm, shared breath, and the knowledge that they had built, brick upon deliberate brick, a life that could withstand tempests. Time, the patient crafter, turned the estate into something that pulsed beyond its own fences. When rain came and stayed, crops fed not only the Pedregrande family, but neighbors. Isaura insisted on a small school. She converted a storeroom into a room with benches and slates. She found a teacher who had the patience of a saint and the appetite for small children. The school was a wary thing at first. Some families feared that learning would make their children restless for city lights. But within 2 seasons, children who had once carried water for hours learned to read their first syllables and to count their hays. Jacira taught girls how to stitch and how to plan for babies. Sebastian taught boys to mend fences and to measure fields. Tertulliano walked among them as a man learning to be lighter with his commands. The fountain of the little community was not a miracle, but the slow work of rechanneling resources. Farmers pooled work. Women who once bartered eggs now held meetings around the storeroom table to arrange seed shares. A small clinic, no more than a shed with wise hands and herbs and a few bandages, kept children from succumbing to fevers that had once seemed inevitable. The people of São Sebastião learned to look outward with a kind of wary pride. They had been taken down. They had gotten up again. Pascual's name receded like a bruise that healed but left a faint purple memory. He remained imprisoned for many years, and his estate in San Jerónimo was parceled out to those who had had claims. The law, in the end, had been a lever when levered correctly. The trial had not fixed every injustice. The town still bore scars of poverty and of men who had been taught to love power more than their neighbors. But the scale had shifted, and the presence of a school and a modest clinic made the shift visible. In the quiet after the legal storms, Isaura found space to breathe and to think about the shape of her life. The auction hammer had once fallen and named her. Now, by slow accretion, she had named herself for others. She had become a steward in the fullest sense, of the land, of children, of memory. She kept Mariana's diary in a drawer and read it sometimes while the children played. She had extended mercy toward Tertulliano for his past, and she had taught him to name his faults without mythologizing them. He, in return, had learned restraint and to channel the power that had once been a weapon into the muscle of defense and the patience of management. One afternoon, when the air had cooled and the represa glinted like a small lake of polished tin, a delegation of villagers came to the house. They brought with them sacks of seeds, a carved wooden bench from the town square, and words that were both simple and tremendous. They had decided, they said, to form a small cooperative for the coming planting season. They would share tools and labor and the profits in a fair way. Isaura looked at their faces, fierce, bright, lined with the maps of many years, and felt a swell in her chest like the first stirrings of rain in a drought. Tertulliano stood beside her, hands in his pockets, the scar on his cheek catching the light like a remembered path. They did not embrace with a sudden malefic triumph. They stood there, partners now by choice rather than by decree. Things could be different, one of the women said, and in that small sentence lay the history of all they had made. Isaura thought of the auction square, of the buying of things and of people, and of the sentence that had once left her breathless. The memory of that command, those 3 words, was a scar not unlike the one on Tertulliano's face, a reminder of a past that had to be honored and learned from, not a chain that needed to be dragged forward. She reached down and took Manuel's hand, then Pedro's, then Carolina's, and let them feel the cool of the represa at the palms of their feet. Water lapped around their toes like a benediction of work. When night came, they lit lamps in the schoolroom and read aloud from books that had once been closed. The piano, which Tertulliano had coaxed into tune, sounded a hesitant, sweet line that filled the courtyard. Neighbors sang. Laughter rose, not loud and careless, but the tempered laughter of people who had known fear and had chosen hope. Isaura sat by the window in their room and watched the rosebush Tertulliano had planted years before. It had grown wild, its thorns a little fierce, its blooms abundant. She had once believed a rose left on a pillow to be a bribe or a trap. Now she saw it as evidence that even things that began cruelly could be tended toward goodness if hands were careful and honest. Outside, the land spread, a mosaic of hard-won furrows and green hope. Within the house, the children slept, and Isaura and Tertulliano spoke in low voices of the future. They had learned that power could be used not to take, but to protect and to build. They had learned that justice could be pursued without letting vengeance bloom into the ground cover of their days. The past had made them wary. The present unmade the old bargains. There was still work to do. There were other men in the region with long memories and debts, other small auctions and hungry ledgers. But the town of São Sebastião had learned to gather and to argue with the law in a way that made it work, for a time, on behalf of the modest and the broken. Isaura, who had once been named by a stranger's command, now moved among the people with the quiet authority of someone who had been to the edge and come back. She kept Mariana's diary in her drawer, not to resurrect tragedy, but to remember it. When she read its lines by lamplight, she saw the hand that had once written them, and she spoke a small private benediction for the woman who had loved and who had been silenced. In the dusk, Tertulliano rose and came to the window. He did not use forceful words. He did not draw attention to the sentence that had once been spat across a marketplace. Instead, he put his hand on the sill and watched the children in the yard where evening chores were being done. He looked at Isaura, and in his face there was something like replenished faith. They had been sold. She had been sold. It was an ugly beginning, stamped with the coarse letter of the old world. But from that sale had emerged, awkward, costly, and human, the possibility of a different order. A house that protected instead of imprisoned. A land that fed instead of bled. A school that taught instead of accepting fate. The notion of power had been reshaped from domination to stewardship, from the cold ownership of a command to the warmer mastery of care. As night pooled and the stars pricked the sky, Isaura thought of the represa, and of the way water gathers into a slow giving. She thought of the children of São Sebastião, and of the names they would learn to write in future years. She thought of the auctioneer's hammer, and how, with softer hands and steadier books, they had hammered a different rhythm into the ground, one that might, if tended, carry their children further than they had once imagined. Outside, on the little path that led to the school, a boy traced a line in the dust with a stick, as if sketching the map of things to come. Inside, Mariana's diary lay closed but not forgotten. Isaura touched the rosebush outside and felt a thorn press against her finger, like a small, honest reminder. They had survived the sale. They had built something that answered the old question of power with labor and law and stubborn compassion. The land would continue to be hard and the sun unrelenting, but there was, at last, a pattern of mutual care forming that could resist the old predators. And in the quiet of the night, when only the crickets and the far-off breath of the represa remained, Tertulliano took Isaura's hand. No command was spoken. The past had been spoken. The present was a hand offered instead of a sentence. Outside, the rose trembled in the gentle wind, thorns and petals both present and honest, and the house breathed a small steady breath, as if learning finally to be a home. Dawn came pale and patient, as if the sky itself were learning to be careful. The rosebush glistened with a thin, honest sweat, and the children rose with the small, eager hunger of those who had slept without fear. In the yard, a goat bleated, as if to remind the world that work began, whether the mind was ready or not. Smoke from a nearby kitchen braided with the mist over the represa, and the sound of a wooden pole striking clean water carried across the furrows like a measured note. Isaura dressed in the same quiet way she had learned to do important things, without flourish, without the old eagerness to be seen. She took Mariana's diary from the drawer and sat at the table near the window. The page she had left closed the night before opened easily under her thumb. The spine had yielded, softened by use and the weight of memory. She read, not for sensation, but for signal, for any sign that might turn a private grief into a public weapon, if that were needed to protect the modest and the broken. The entries were small and tight, a hand practiced in both caution and wanting. Mariana had written of the heat, of the hush in the house after an argument, of the way Tertulliano used to laugh when a horse misstepped. But elsewhere the script loosened and the lines shortened into lists, sums, times, names. The numbers made a map of what had been traded: a pair of oxen for a season's worth of seed, a roof for a debt, a name placed next to a figure like a pin in the ground. Isaura's finger stilled on a single line, where a name was written and then, as if in a sudden flinch, crossed out and replaced with another. She read it again. There were mistakes in any ledger, but not always such quick, furious corrections. The ink bled like a conscience. A sentence further down, 2 words and a date, made the breath leave her in a faint, measured way. She folded the page and did not tell Tertulliano what she had seen. There are weapons, she thought, that make innocence into accusation. There are also, she knew now, ways of holding a weapon without sharpening it. Tertulliano had already left for the small meeting near the fountain. The elders had agreed to gather as the light warmed. They would speak of the represa, of the sluices that had been loosened by winter rains, and of the need to keep the flow measured so each field would drink what it needed, and none would be strangled. They would speak of the auctions still whispering on the outskirts of the county, of men who kept accounts like traps. He moved among them with a steady sort of authority, hands calloused from fixing fences rather than from issuing commands, voice low and precise. At the fountain, the town's council was a long table of faces worn by more than age, by memory. There was Mestre Lorenzo, who taught the children to make letters out of lumps of clay, and who had the habit of tapping a small stick against his palm when thinking. There was Donna Lucia, who ran the new school with the stubborn tenderness of someone who had found a calling late and refused to let it go. There were men who had once been slaves in another life and had learned to keep their silence. Their presence now was measured like a pledge. A boy from the market, no more than 16, brought news with a folded handkerchief. A man from the valley with a ledger the size of a hymn book had been seen the day before on the road. He carries it open, the boy said. He reads it like a rosary. Tertulliano's face did something the town had come to trust. It turned the shape of thought outward into an action. "We will take the book to the magistrates," he said. "We will show the magistrate our receipts, our witnesses. We will not let memory be ledgered into theft." Donna Lucia's eyes softened. "And if the magistrate is as deaf as some men say?" Then we make noise with testimony, said Mestre Lorenzo. If paper lies, the people will not. There was a moment when the council looked at Isaura as if by inclination, for she had a way of being both still and present. She had not yet told them about Mariana's handwriting. She could have carried the page herself into the room and placed it among the town's other scraps of proof, let the pattern become plain. Instead, she folded the diary back and placed both palms on it as if in prayer, an action that was not wholly different. Let us go together, Tertulliano said, turning his head toward her door. Not only with books, but with the faces of those who know what quiet looks like. Let them see that our people are not numbers to be hammered down. She met his hand, and it was the same as the night before, steady, warm, open. We will bring witnesses too, she said. Martha with her ledger of oats, old Pedro who kept watch by the represa when the night thieved animals. Testimony is not only ink. They walked through the town as a small, deliberate procession. Neighbors dropped into step without being asked, women with baskets of bread, a man with a hoe resting on his shoulder, two girls clasping a slate between them. The procession was not a show of force so much as the visible proof of what they had built, a community that refused to be broken by the shorthand of debt. At the edge of the square, a rider had come to thunder. The man who dismounted wore boots that had seen the same sun as the rest of them, but had not learned its kindness. His coat was too new, and his eyes too quick with the hunger of a calculator. He introduced himself curtly as Señor Rocha, and carried the ledger like a priest carries a missal. It was indeed a large volume, bound with straps and with a brass plate on the cover where initials shimmered. I have accounts here that must be settled, he said. There are many who must pay, and those who do not will see their land at auction. A hush, then a scattering of measured murmurs. The townspeople had heard similar pronouncements before, men who counted time in interest rates and cold sums. Isaura felt, in the center of her chest, a dull, careful anger. She remembered the hammer on a marketplace, how quick and small it had felt when it fell, and how a name could be offered and then stamped with an authority that ate what lay under it. Tertulliano stepped forward. You may show the magistrate your accounts, he said. We will not fight a man rather than a law, but we will bring our proofs and our people. Rocha's smile was like a hinge. It opened and then it shut. Sooner or later, he said, the law pays the man who writes it down. Mestre Lorenzo cleared his throat. He held up a thin folder of parchment. We have receipts, he said. We have original records and witnesses. We have the names of those who signed. Rocha's face tightened as if a pin had been driven through the soft part of his mouth. Then let us go to the magistrate with what you have, but do not think we will be unready. The ledger I carry names more than one man, and the law is not a thing that forgets. They walked to the magistrate's house, an austere building of whitewashed walls and a small courtyard where a fig tree shaded the windows. The magistrate himself was a man of middle years, with a beard that looked as if it had once been combed but had since resigned to natural behavior. He received them with the civil gravity of a gatekeeper and the little impatience of someone whose job required him to be both law and timekeeper. All petitions in the morning, he told them, setting down a pot of tea as if to punctuate the saying, bring your papers. They unrolled their proofs as if laying out a harvest, receipts with charcoal smudges, the signatures of men who would swear, if needed, that they had been forced by hunger, the indentations of numbers that suggested coercion rather than consent. The magistrate tapped the ledger. His finger followed the ink like a man tracing a road he did not yet intend to walk. You have a case, he said. We will docket it and call witnesses. But law requires precision. Bring the names, bring clear dates, and, he hesitated, a small fissure in his practiced face, bring anything that proves duress. The court will not be moved by sentiment. Tertulliano's jaw set. We will bring it. When they left, Rocha watched them go from the threshold as if each of them were a piece on a board. In the street, a woman who had sold a calf for 1/3 its value spoke, quietly, but with the kind of force that comes from remembering hunger as well as hope. "He will return with more men," she said. "He will not like the magistrate's slower law." "It is already thought of," Isaura replied without looking up from the diary she had secreted into the folds of her skirt. "We have times for law, we have times for song. We will not throw ourselves into the hammer until all proof is laid." That night, the town's kitchen was fuller than it had been in months. Bread was passed, tea poured, stories traded like small liturgies. The children practiced letters at the long table on slates, their chalk making bright scratches, A, B, C, that tasted like opening a door. One of the younger boys who had once been sold by the same hand that had named them learned to write his name, and then, with the portentous solemnity of someone practicing a spell, wrote the name of his mother in the margin and pinned it with a small secret smile. Isaura read Mariana's diary again by the lamplight, each page a little island of an absent voice. There were moments when she felt as if the room had been seen through someone else's narrow eyes. In a passage she had not noticed before, a phrase stood: "If anyone asks, say the ledger was forged." Simple, terrible. It suggested that someone, perhaps the auctioneer, perhaps a scribe, had been instructed to alter numbers, to make what was thin into an ocean. She ran her finger under the words and tasted the metal tang of fear. The diary, which she had kept as a memorial to a woman who had been silenced, now hummed with the possibility of speech. "Do you think we should show the magistrate?" she asked the empty room. Then, because Tertulliano came in as if summoned. He had the look of a man who had been to many kind of hearings and had learned that victory often wore the skin of patience. "If it proves there was forgery," he said, "it will save others. And if it does not, if the magistrate calls it an imperfect recollection, if he says it is not enough?" Tertulliano paused at the window and watched the moon ride low over the represa. "Then we keep gathering what is enough," he said. "We will not let fear decide what memory must do." Days passed as if the town were learning a new rhythm, the careful discipline of law married to the old insistence of labor. The represa sluices were tended not only for crops, but as a practice of care. The town's water no longer poured like a gratuity to the highest bidder, but like bread, portioned according to need. Fields that had once been dashed by greed now took root slowly. Seedlings were sheltered like small promises. Word came from another district. An auction had been called for a cluster of families whose ledgers had been bundled in a way that made the sum look greater than it ought. The auctioneer, a man whose name had once made women in São Sebastião cross themselves, was to come with the brass hammer. For some, the hammer was still a sentence. For others, it was an instrument of justice. Isaura and Tertulliano decided to go. The magistrate's notice had placed a date. The town would send its witnesses and its receipts. The road to the neighboring village was dry and full of wind that tried to take ideas off the road like feathers. They walked with Mestre Lorenzo and Donna Lucia, with Maria, who had taught the children to sew, and with Paulo, who had once been a hired hand and had kept, in the back of his mind, the shape of what was right. When they arrived, the square was already full of people who had learned to listen for the sound of the hammer. The auctioneer's stand was set up on planks. A pile of papers was tied with a string as neat as a noose. The man himself had a jaw like a plane, intimidation sanded into his face. He did not look up as they approached, but when he did, his eyes were exactly what they had been before, small and precise. "We are here," Tertulliano said, "but not with challenge, only with a muscle of warning. We bring witnesses and receipts." The auctioneer smiled as if he had been given something he liked. "Then let the book be opened," he said. "We will see if the claims are true." Mestre Lorenzo put a hand on the ledger and opened it. The pages when turned made the dry, clean sound of papers that had been held like a relic. For a time, the auction moved with the rhythm expected. A name called, a hammer raised, a land passed. But then Dona Lucia stood and spoke. She read a list, dates, amounts, names, and then she read fragments from Mariana's diary. The crowd fell quiet. The diary's voice was a small thing, but it was not to be underestimated. There was a man in the back, a clerk perhaps, whose fingers trembled when he saw the passage. His mouth worked like a bellows. That was the direction, he muttered. Write it like so. Make the sums close. The auctioneer's brow nodded. He looked at his ledger, and then at the magistrate's clerk who had come to observe. A murmur moved through the square and gathered like a windstorm. When a second clerk, an older woman who had once been the auctioneer's scribe, stepped forward and testified that she had been told to alter entries, something in the air broke like a glass underfoot. "Were you told to make the ledger look greater?" Tertulliano asked, not as a prosecutor, but as someone willing the truth to open. The woman did not look at him, as if not to be intimidated by his steadiness. She let the square take her confession as a public thing. "I was told the debt should appear larger," she said. "They said if it looked less, people would clamor." The auctioneer's face drained as if someone had taken the color with a cloth. He opened his mouth and closed it. Reputation, once an armor, rusted quickly under admission. At the magistrate's bench, a clerk took down the testimony. The magistrate himself appeared, having been summoned after the crowd spilled into voices. He listened with the formal patience of someone whose authority required him to hear both accusation and defense. When the clerk read Mariana's line aloud, "If anyone asks, say the ledger was forged," the effect was not dramatic so much as clarifying, like a window opened to a yard that had been mistaken for a wilderness. Eyes moved to Isaura. She felt the weight of what a private grief could become. There was, in the hush, the simple question of what justice seeks: to punish one man or to restore a people. She understood that a ledger's correction might free many, but it might also lead to revenge if wielded only as a weapon. She wanted more than retribution. She wanted repair. The magistrate spoke in a voice that had been the sound of small towns for years. "This court will hear more witnesses," he said. "There will be an inquiry into forgery and about who ordered the changes. If coercion is proven, the sales will be annulled. All who would hide behind numbers shall be made to answer." Rocha's name floated in the square. He was not yet present, but the air was telling of the path he might take now that his ledger had been challenged. The auctioneer, whose hands had once known the satisfaction of a clean strike, now looked small and uncertain. He gathered his papers as if they might be taken from him before he could do anything. In the hush that followed, a small boy, no older than 7, ran into the magistrate's courtyard, breathless and with dust in his hair. He carried in his hand a scrap of paper like a folded flag. "Found it," he panted. "It had a name." Tertulliano took the paper with gentle fingers. The name was not one of the great men of the valley, but a local scribe's shorthand that matched an initial in Rocha's ledger. The child's discovery was small, and yet it landed like a match in a stack of dry wood. Isaura looked at the magistrate. The man's face had the color of someone who understood the consequence of opening a ledger secret. "We will continue the inquiry," he said. "Return in 2 days with all witnesses. No sale will proceed until then." Outside, as the people dispersed, there was talk of other ledgers, of more altered pages. The magistrate's hold on the auctioneer's hammer had stopped the first strike. It had not, however, ended the hunger that had fed the auctioneer's hand. As they walked back to São Sebastião, the sun broke through in a stronger light. Children chased the dog that had found a bone. The represa seemed to breathe easier, as if the town's care had policed the water's anxieties. Tertulliano walked without speaking much. Isaura kept the diary close against her chest, like something both fragile and decisive. That night, Isaura sat at the table and thought of Mariana not as a ghost, but as a person whose final acts had become a kind of testimony. She uncapped the lamp and read further, searching for anything else that might help, in the diary, in the wrinkles of handwriting, in the way certain letters leaned. There were names she had not noticed, a marginal note here, and the frayed edge of a page where ink had bled. She traced the scar of a cross made in haste. Then she stopped, for there was at the very end a line she had not found before, barely an afterthought. If it comes to the magistrate, do not ask for vengeance, ask only that the seeds be returned. The sentence steadied her like a small bridge across a rushing stream. It reframed the diary not simply as evidence, but as plea. Mariana had walked a dangerous road. Her last words were not a trap, but an insistence that the work of recovery be careful. Tertulliano, she said when he came in, his face gray with the day's small triumphs and wear. She wanted the seeds returned. He sat and took her hand, and for a while they said nothing at all. Outside, a child practiced the loop of his letters on a slate, his chalk a soft sound that promised more than the court could do in a day. "We will ask for more than annulment," Tertulliano said at last. "We will ask for restoration. The magistrate can return what was taken, and the town can tend it. Someone must teach the men who profit how to account for more than themselves." Isaura let the thought settle into her like a garment. The hours that followed were busy with preparation rather than panic. They collected witnesses, ironed receipts, and arranged that the children be sheltered in the school while the town's adults went to speak. There was a stirring in the air that was not simply fear. It was the steady making of a people who would not accept being numbered away. On the morning set by the magistrate, São Sebastião arrived like a pressed cloth at the court, tidy, strong, and resolute. They brought with them not only paper, but the stories that give numbers a human shape. When the magistrate asked whether the town sought punishment or restoration, Isaura stepped forward, diary in hand, and spoke in the voice that had learned to hold both sorrow and hope. "We seek what was taken to be given back," she said. "We seek that the seeds be returned to those who planted them, and that the law makes sure such ledgers no longer bind children to hunger." The magistrate listened, and when he looked at the papers and at the faces gathered around him, there was for a moment the sense that law and mercy might meet on a narrow road and not collide. Beyond the court's doors, the valley breathed and waited. Men with long memories had been given pause, but not yet persuasion. Somewhere down the road, Rocha would decide whether to contest or to bargain. The town prepared for either eventuality by rehearsing not only its proofs, but the small acts of repair. Seeds stored and cataloged, a plan to teach families how to save, a rota of attendance at the fields so that no one would be alone with fear. As they returned, the children ran ahead to the school where a new board had been painted with the names of donors and a small, crooked list of rules. Share seed, teach others, keep watch. The represa caught the afternoon light and made it into a plate of silver. The rosary of water drops across the sluices hummed like a vow. That night, when the town gathered to break bread, Isaura put Mariana's diary back in its drawer. It had served the town, and now it would rest as witness and reminder. She placed her hands on the closed leather and felt the memory like a pulse. There was no victory yet. The law had been set into motion, the people had been seen, and the child's scrap of paper had become a hinge. But there remained the men with long memories, the hunger for profit thin as a knife, and the fact that the auctioneer's own conscience could bend either way. Tertulliano sat with his hand in hers, and they looked out at the field where a boy traced his map in the dust. The map was nothing more than a line, But like so many acts that remake a place, it was also the beginning of something that might be followed. In the quiet, Isaura leaned her head on his shoulder and for the first time in many seasons let herself think of a future where names were not tags of ownership but promises. They had not ended the story, they had only turned a page. The represa kept its slow generosity. The rose outside the window had closed for the night and would open again in the morning. The town would return to work, to teaching, to the small liturgies of tending.
But now, when the auctioneer lifted his hammer, there would be more eyes watching, more witnesses to count the weight of what fell. And somewhere beyond the magistrate's door, a man with a ledger slept with the sound of numbers in his head, while a piece of stray paper carried a name that could not, any longer, be ignored.